Greetings and welcome to another edition of Montpelier Connection. I'm State Representative Mike Mrowicki, and this is a pre-election edition of Montpelier Collection, and just wanted to share that while there are lots of people on the ballot, there are also some very important proposals on the ballot that we'll be voting on, and we're going to look at one of those issues today. Many people may have heard of Prop 5 and Article 22, the Reproductive Liberty Amendment. And that's certainly an important one, but for a lot of people, just as important is Prop 2 or Article 2. And this is the Anti-Slavery Amendment. And today's guest here is the Reverend Debbie Ingram of Vermont Interfaith Action. She's going to tell us about this. Welcome, Debbie.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Wonder if you could just take a moment and introduce yourself and Vermont Interfaith Action, what you do for them and with them.
Certainly. I am Debbie Ingram, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Interfaith Action. I've been doing that job for about 15 years now. VIA is a faith-based community organizing federation of over 70 congregations throughout Vermont. And we work together to try to affect systemic change on issues of social and economic justice. So racial justice has been one thing that is very important to us, and that's why Prop 2 was a natural fit for us.
Yeah. So what does Prop 2 say exactly? Like when people go into the voting booth, what will they see for Article 2?
Well, Prop 2, the article dates back all the way to the beginning of the Constitution. It was originally written in 1777, so 245 years ago now. And although it underwent a slight change in the 1920s, essentially it stayed the same for the whole time. There's a preamble that talks about how important it is for there to be liberty and independence among people who live in Vermont. But then there's a long sort of archaic use of language that talks about slavery and indentured servitude, and basically outlines 3 exceptions to the prohibition against slavery and indentured servitude. One is for people who are under the age of 21. One is for people who consent to being indentured or enslaved. And the last one is as punishment for damages, debts, fines, and costs. So that language, even though there are people who believe, and we have been taught in Vermont for a long time, that we were the first to actually abolish slavery, but that language really creates exceptions that are unacceptable, really, in today's age. And so what Proposal 2 will do is strike all that archaic language that has the exceptions in it, and then instead end the sentence very simply and succinctly by saying slavery and indentured servitude in any form are prohibited. So it couldn't be more straightforward and unambiguous, and that's what we really want in our Constitution.
Yeah. Now, is Vermont the only state with this issue?
No, not at all. Actually, there are about 25 other states who are also facing the idea that their constitutions have exceptions for slavery. And there have been 4 that have already taken this out of their constitutions. That's Rhode Island, Nebraska, Utah, and Colorado. And then there are 4 others besides Vermont who are facing this on their ballots this year. So we're being called the Freedom 5, and the Freedom 5 are Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, Oregon, and Vermont. And actually, in fact, our United States Constitution also has one major exception in the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was passed right after the Civil War to try to abolish slavery, but there's an exception there too, which is for punishment of a crime. And so there's also a national movement to get that taken out of our U.S. Constitution too. So there's statewide movements and the national movement.
Um, how did this movement start to change the Constitution here?
Well, the first I heard of it actually was through the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, because I think it was it was a little known fact, really, that that the Constitution begins this way. And I know, actually, just personally, I ran for the state senate, and well, I actually served in the state senate for 4 years. And when I was running in 2016, I attended a candidates forum, and Mark Hughes, the director of the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, was hosting it. And one of the questions he asked all of us was, were we aware of the wording of around slavery in the Vermont Constitution, and that there were these exceptions? And none of us were aware of that. We were all surprised to hear that. And, I pledged at that time that if I were to be elected, I would try to do something about that. And so that's the way amendments to our Constitution work, actually, is that they can only be introduced by members of the Senate, and they can only be introduced every 4 years. So, my first opportunity to introduce any kind of legislation was in 2019, and there was widespread support. It may have started with me, but there was certainly a huge amount of support from my fellow senators and from the President Pro Tem of the Senate at the time, Tim Ash. And so we started the ball rolling, and it's a long process to amend our state constitution. Because the amendment has to pass the House and the Senate in 2 successive 2-year terms. So we've done that. So it's taken, though, since 2019 to go through that part of the process, and then the very final step is for the voters to vote to approve it.
Yeah. People will say, well, the law has been that way for a long time, and what's the problem?
Yes, we have definitely heard that. But, well, part of the problem is that we've really never lived in a country where slavery has been completely abolished. Some people will say, well, there was the Emancipation Proclamation, and then there was the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and there aren't plantations anymore. Well, the Emancipation Proclamation actually only covered the states that were rebelling against the Union, only freed slaves in those places. So it didn't do it throughout the nation. The 13th Amendment, as I've already pointed out, has an exception in it. And well, it may be true that there aren't plantations anymore. Just the idea of slavery, the moral principle around allowing one person to own another person, even if it's just on paper, is wrong. And Vermont Interfaith Action represents people of faith and goodwill, and people. I think anybody who is decently minded will recognize that it's really morally reprehensible to have this reference to slavery. It's not in keeping with our values now, so we really need to get rid of it.
Now, looking back in American history, this seems to be connected to attempts to look at how racism, systemic racism, took hold in this country. And if we could go back a little, can you share a little bit about the timeline of what was happening, let's see, from the Civil War to emancipation, Reconstruction? What were the conditions that have moved us along here?
Yes, yeah, it's very interesting. The Civil War, of course, was primarily fought over slavery, and Reconstruction followed the end of the war. But of course, President Lincoln was assassinated just 6 days after the surrender at Appomattox. So even though there had already been plans in place for Reconstruction, and there were a couple of different civil rights acts that were passed immediately after the end of the war, that stated things like, everyone was created equal, and that there should be no discrimination based on status of having been enslaved, and that kind of language. It didn't take too long. It was just in the 1880s, 1883, when the Supreme Court got the chance to rule on it, was because this language also was in the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And they, it's very harkens to what we have going on in modern times. The Supreme Court basically negated what had been said in those two amendments, and they said that they could not be used to prohibit discrimination on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude. So, very, very shortly after the Civil War, it was set up that there could be discrimination, and that's exactly what happened. First, there were what was known as black codes. Black people were arrested and imprisoned for very minor crimes like petty theft and loitering, the kinds of crimes that white people would not probably have even been arrested for, much less imprisoned for.
Were there two sets of laws for black and white then?
Yeah, I mean, you could pretty much say that. I think, yes, I think that's fair to say. There were the black codes for black people. There were all kinds of exceptions for they couldn't walk freely in their own towns. Sometimes they had to have passes to get from one part of town to another. They weren't paid the same wages at all for the same work. If they were in, and then once they were in prison, white business owners could do convict leasing, so they could pay the prison for the convicts to come and work for their businesses, and the individuals didn't get paid for that. So yes, there was definitely one kind of set of conditions for black people and a different one for white people.
So were these state laws, federal laws, or both?
Mostly state laws,
Yeah.
but there was nothing that once the Supreme Court kind of negated the federal protections, there was nothing that the federal government could do to stop it.
Yeah. So that brings us to the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Great Migration happened, where thousands and thousands of African Americans moved from the South to the North. And how did those northern states do with welcoming these new residents?
Well, yeah, we started the Jim Crow laws. So we moved from the black codes into Jim Crow laws, which were all about segregation. And those laws may have started in southern states, but you're absolutely right. Once black people started moving in large numbers to northern states, there was that same kind of racial prejudice and discrimination, and the same kind of laws, same kind of Jim Crow laws were set up all over the country, definitely in the North as well.
And how was Vermont in this historical time period? That some people have, and I'm not sure, but for instance, was the KKK in Vermont?
Yes, I believe there was evidence that there was some KKK activity. There were certainly, we have a lot of history of deeds that had racial covenants, racial restrictions in the deeds of, so the sale of land and housing was prohibited to people, to black people. We can still find that actually those have not been, a lot of those have not been gotten rid of. And so they are still attached to some people's land and housing even today.
We actually put a law out there this last session in regards to deed covenants. And it's interesting how the impetus for that started, where former U.S. Chief Justice Rehnquist
Mhm.
bought a property in Vermont. And you want to pick up the story there?
Right, yes, yeah, it was a vacation property, I believe, and yeah, here's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and there was a racially restrictive covenant, and also I think other religions too. I think the Jewish people,
Anti-Semitic.
anti-Semitic, right? Yes, exactly. So yes, that was kind of embarrassing, I think, for him to discover.
Yeah. So we have done something about that. So here we are, 21st century, and this is still on the books. We're trying to take a bigger look and step back and look at systemic racism, and we come up against this. So I'm seeing that's the impetus for why we want to take a look at this. This is a part of looking at systemic racism.
That's right, it is. And, and Vermonters can be proud because we have already taken steps to acknowledge that there is systemic racism, that, and this means, this is not, some people get confused between overt racism and systemic racism. This doesn't mean that, we have necessarily people rampantly committing hate crimes or using offensive language. That's what some people associate with racism, but systemic racism means that the very institutions that we have set up, so from education to healthcare to policing to criminal justice, to all kinds of economic opportunities and housing and land ownership, that all of those systems have built into them advantages for white people at the expense of Black people and other people of color. And that's what we found here in Vermont and what we acknowledge. And so our Attorney General has issued a report that talked about the legacy of slavery leading to systemic racism, and the legislature has set up the Office of Racial Equity with a director who is tasked at trying to identify areas of systemic racism in our government and to address them and correct them. So, we've already taken some really, really good steps, and we can be proud of that. But this is another step that is important, another acknowledgement, a moral statement, a statement about our values in the document that is explicitly written to express our state's values. Yeah. And so we can use that as a tool and as the foundation to continue our fight against systemic racism.
Yeah. So this will be on the ballot November 8th. Vermont Interfaith and the Racial Justice Alliance have been working on advocacy for that. What if people want to get involved with that?
Well, we would love for them to do that, and it's a perfect opportunity too, because it's not going to go on for years and years. There's a finite period of time, right? So, so if they'd like to get involved, I would recommend going to our website, which is viavt.org, or the campaign's website is abolishslaveryvt.org. And we have we're going to be doing some phone banking. We've been doing some tabling at different public events like farmers markets. We're going to be doing some door-to-door canvassing. There's also we'll have a social media toolkit. So if you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, we'll have things you can post. So lots of different opportunities.
Now, my understanding is that there's pledge cards that you're asking people to sign up to pledge to vote for this.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. That's right. We have pledge cards online, but we also have them in hard copies, and we are trying to kind of count the numbers of how many people are pledging to vote yes on Prop 2, so it would be great if you could either do it online or come to one of our tables. We also will have lawn signs. Lawn signs are big in Vermont. We have t-shirts if you want to wear your t-shirts around town. And all of these things will help us get out the word.
So being in Vermont, a lot of people might say, how could this fail? I mean, my understanding is, though, that Colorado put this on the ballot several years ago. And what happened there?
That's right. The first time they put it on their ballot, people were confused about the wording partly, and then also they hadn't run a very robust campaign, and so people didn't know about it. And it didn't pass the first time, so they had to go back and put it on the ballot again, and it did pass the second time. But our process is even longer than Colorado, so it would be another several years, probably another 4 years before we'd be able to pass it if we don't do it this time.
So we want to get the vote out for this now.
That's right.
Well, anything else you want to share with voters out there before we have to go?
Well, just really hope that everybody is gung-ho about voting. We've got a lot to vote on this time. It's a midterm election, not a presidential election, but we have a lot of turnover in our offices, and we have these two proposals, which is very unusual for Vermont. So it's really a good time for people to exercise their democratic rights.
So what was the website again, the URL for Vermont Interfaith?
VIAVT.org.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure the post-production puts that up on the screen there, and people can get in touch with you then.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Debbie, thank you so much for taking the time and for this work. In trying to be fully transparent here, I will say that my year-round job is also working with Vermont Interfaith, so I'm aware of this work and feel very good to be supportive of this kind of social justice action, and hope we can get a good, strong vote on this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the good people at Brattleboro Community TV. BCTV has been doing a great job through COVID, and now as we're easing out of it, to bring a lot of this important information to viewers there. So thanks to them, and thanks to you for tuning in. Until next time, I'm Mike Mrowicki. Bye-bye now.